Everyone else. And my thoughts for today are: we often talk about Lag BaOmer. It is a special Jewish holiday, so I thought that today we'll spend some time talking about the significance of Lag BaOmer, what it means to us, what it is about, and I hope you'll all learn from that. We are in the middle of a previous conversation, specifically by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But some people tell me they weren't very familiar with what Lag BaOmer is. So I thought that today that we will talk about Lag BaOmer itself, and then we could get back to the details of it, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who he was, and all those things on another day. And you'll have to forgive me. I was on the road yesterday with my kids. It was their day off school, and we took the opportunity to go on a little bit of a family outing. So I don't have a presentation to share with you today. So you'll just bear with me. We'll talk, we'll discuss. You're the presentation. Each one of us are the presentation for today. And just feel free to engage, to talk with me, to ask any questions you might have. And that's what we'll do. So let's begin. There's different angles of where to begin from. I'll start with what's more conventionally known about this day, Lag BaOmer. Last week or the week before, we learned about Sfiras HaOmer. We talked about the 49-day counting, how we're preparing from Pesach to Shavuos, which is about counting each one of these days, and not only counting the days, but making each and every one of these days count and refining ourselves. And in fact, one could ask, is it possible in 49 days that we could really transform ourselves? Can we really metamorphosize from who we are to who we can become? And I think it's a valid question. That is it really possible to change our habits in such a short amount of time? But perhaps it is possible. If I'm a short-tempered person, can I learn to become more patient and more tolerant? If I'm a whatever habit or addiction I might be stuck with, can I really fix it during this time? And perhaps the answer is indeed, because every day we're working on ourselves. We're not only counting the days, we're making every single day count. And how are we doing so? By counting the sphera. And along with counting the sphera, when we open our siddur here, we read each day, there's a particular aspect, an attribute within ourselves that we are refining, that we're working on ourselves. That means we're working to become better individuals each and every single day. So like the story, the famous personality of this period is Rabbi Akiva, right? And his students. But Rabbi Akiva didn't become that great teacher just like that. In fact, he was an ignorant person until the age of 40, right? We know a lot about his history, and maybe we'll talk more about that now as well. But Rabbi Akiva, when he realized that the water that drips into that rock was able to penetrate a hole, he realized incrementally, step by step, drop by drop, we can change, we can become better. And I think as individuals as well, each of us has the potential, has the ability of really becoming better people. And that's what we work on during this time from Pesach to Shavuos. So there's 49 days from Pesach to Shavuos. The 33rd day of this countdown is Lag BaOmer. Today we're holding at 31 days of the countdown. So just imagine, these days are flying quick. But Lag BaOmer, we know, is a day of celebration. It's a festive day that we really always looked forward to. In my childhood and in our adulthood, in fact, I can invite each and every one of you, if you want, tomorrow evening, please God, we're going to have a celebration at our shul, and you're all welcome to come, no charge. Of course, donations are welcome to help cover the cost. We're going to have a braai, we're going to have a bonfire, we're going to have a kumzitz, we're going to sit around, we're going to tell stories, we're going to sing songs. We're going to be in the atmosphere of Lag BaOmer. What is, a good question, somebody just asked, what is Lag BaOmer? Well, that's what I'm getting to. But of course, Lag, or as some South Africans like to pronounce it as a Lach, because the G here is a Ch. The Lag is actually two letters, Lamed and Gimel, which in Hebrew, letters are numbers as well as words. So you have the letter Lamed and Gimel coming together. Lamed is 30, Gimel is 3, so you have the number 33. This is the 33rd day of the Omer counting. Now, of course, our calendars, you notice Ramadan every year is a different time on the Gregorian calendar. So Ramadan might currently be in a different time than it was in previous years. In fact, we've talked about Ramadan previously, even though it's not the point of our discussions here. We don't discuss Ramadan and the other holidays, but it is on the Hebrew calendar also. Our festivals are not all going to be on the same day of the Gregorian calendar each year. And that's very simple because the calendars are not synchronized. The Hebrew calendar is one that's a combination of the lunar and solar cycles, whereas the Muslim calendar is purely lunar. So it has got only 354 days each year. That's why Ramadan's always 11 days apart from the regular Gregorian calendar. Each year it's moving back 11 days. Our Jewish calendar is a mix of solar lunar. For example, next year, I think, will be a leap year, in which case we're going to have a longer Hebrew year, whereas this year's not a leap year, right? So that's just to bring it in sync with each other, that Pesach will always be in the springtime. Whatever the case is, this Thursday, what's the date this Thursday? Today's the 28th, so we're looking at tomorrow night's Lag BaOmer, tomorrow evening, could you believe it, 29th. Every year it's different. Last year it was in May, and it all depends on the calendar. But the point is that Lag is these two letters, Lamed and Gimel, which is 33, hence it's the 33rd day of the Omer counting. Now, some festivals are biblical in origin, others are rabbinical, and others are not even holidays, but rather just days of significance. Lag BaOmer is not a festival per se. It's not like Pesach, but it's certainly a day of significance in our calendar, and it is celebrated with tremendous joy, with fanfare, with people have bonfires and braais and go out with bows and arrows, and we'll talk about some of the aspects, hopefully, of how Lag BaOmer is to be celebrated. Why do we celebrate on this day is a very important question. So firstly, it's the day that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai passed away, and he requested that the day of his passing should be celebrated. It should not be a sad day, which if you go back to last week's shiur, we discussed it in greater detail of the fact that he specifically requested that it shouldn't be a sad day, whereas ordinarily the day someone passes on is commemorated as a sad day. But it also celebrates the end of a terrible plague that took the lives of Rabbi Akiva's students, which we also discussed previously. It's hard to relate to how can a pandemic really take so many lives. Well, unfortunately, the number of lives lost to this pandemic, to COVID-19, I was in shul this morning and talking with one of my colleagues, mentioned a Rabbi who we had, a teacher in yeshiva back in the day. And he said to me, "Oh, do you know he passed away from COVID-19? I didn't know. He was not very old, maybe in his 70s. But COVID-19 has really taken so many lives." And sadly, that's the case, that there was a pandemic, took the lives of so many of Rabbi Akiva's students, and this pandemic came to an end. Maybe they found their vaccine back then on Lag BaOmer. So it's worthwhile to talk about both of these events, the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, to analyze a little bit of the history, to discuss some of the traditions, maybe the mystery, and the significance of this day. And of course, the way we learn here is we don't talk his story. Here we talk about our story. So it's important that we don't just discuss the past, but the current lessons that we could apply to our own lives. What has it got to do with us? What's its modern relevance to you and I today? That's really what is important for us to discuss. And although I mentioned Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai first, I want to start with the students of Rabbi Akiva because chronologically that occurred before the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because Rabbi Shimon was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and he's one of those who passed away during this time, except it was on this day. So when we talked about Rabbi Akiva began, I think it was last week we mentioned this, that Rabbi Akiva began to study at the age of 40. Again, another lesson which we just came from the festival of Pesach Sheni on Monday. Pesach Sheni reminds us it's never too late. I know for some of you 40 sounds very young. For me, that's still 22 years away. Whatever the case is, it's a late start for rabbinic training. And yet he became one of the greatest sages in Jewish history. So what does that tell us? I think it's, again, a powerful lesson about it's never too late. Regardless of your age and stage in life, you could always jump on the bandwagon. You could always join along. You could always do what you can to make repairs and to catch up. And our sages compared the methodology of Rabbi Akiva's study and the way he taught his students to that of a sharecropper. Sharecropper goes out into the field, places his wheat in one basket, and his barley in another, the spelt in a third basket, beets in another one, right? He divides things. And when he comes home or to his warehouse, he's going to organize everything. He's going to put each food in the right place where it belongs. And likewise, the Talmud says Rabbi Akiva, he would study different disciplines of Torah. Right, we have, I'm sure back then was less than today, because today, how many books have you got on your bookshelf? Go into a Jewish library, right here at Chabad House, downstairs. We have a wonderful library filled with lots of great books for you to study. So there's so much to study. And one could say, I'll never have the time to study every aspect, every discipline, every different field, every topic and subject in Judaism. Well, Rabbi Akiva, the Talmud says, he organized his study in a particular way so that he was able to learn the entire Torah in a systematic way, like the sharecropper. And he became one of those great sages of his time, even though he started so much later. And he, in fact, had so many students because of the methodology. Maybe he taught the different students in different ways of how they needed to learn. But he was ensuring the transmission of Torah to the next generation. And to ensure that his knowledge would be accurately taught, transmitted, he taught 24,000 students. And now to think about that, so many students for one teacher, it could be that there were students of students, and he had different students teaching different students, and they were divided into various different groups. They each specialized perhaps in different topics and in different areas of Jewish study. Think about it. We have halacha, we have Jewish law, right? We have Hasidus, we have mysticism, we have Talmud, we have Jewish history. There's so many different aspects, so many different topics and fields of Jewish study to get acquainted with. So think about an average class today maybe has 25 kids when I was growing up, we had 35 students in our class. But if I think about my kids, somewhere around 25 students in a class. So 25,000 students would require 1,000 teachers. Okay, that's a lot of students. That's a lot of teachers. But he had a big school of study. And I guess this was his way of ensuring that Torah would be transmitted, would continue to be taught, the different aspects of Torah, despite the Roman ban of Torah study during his time, because he lived in a period when the Romans controlled Israel and forbade the study and practice of Judaism. So Rabbi Akiva's methodology was one that would ensure the Torah would not be forgotten, and that if in one part of the world, perhaps Jews were under attack, at least in another part of the world, there would be Jews who can continue to preserve the studies of Judaism. So that was his his way. And tragically, so many of those students died during this time between Pesach and Shavuos. And their death was certainly a terrible blow to the future of the Jewish people. Think about so many students dying. The very people who were expected to ensure the transmission of Judaism, of the Jewish law, of our traditions, were now dead. And how would Judaism survive? That was all at risk. And the truth is, the Gemara says that there were survivors, and there were certain students who he then gathered in the south of Israel, and he was able to teach them. But you think about how COVID-19 has affected so many in our time. It certainly affected the students of Rabbi Akiva in that time, where so many people died. This was, what period was this? Rabbi Akiva lived during the time of the destruction of the temple. We're talking probably about 50 years after the temple destruction. And this is around the time that the emperor of the time of Kievman, and he was the one who enacted all these schools, all these laws forbidding Jewish practice. And it was during that time as well that we had the Dark Pashto was done. So you had the story of Masada. Masada attack that happened. Question. So that's some of the history of that. And that's why we have all these morning practices, why we don't listen to music. If you turn on Jewish radio, you're only getting a cappella. Well, obviously it's different shows, but at least during the religious hour on Soul to Soul. Ashley, Sheila, you have questions? Sheila, Ashley?
Not.
No? Okay, so if you don't mind to just mute yourself then, because otherwise it's interfering and people on the other networks who are listening in are, there we go. Thank you. So that's the reason why we have these various practices of mourning, of grieving during this particular time. So the specific ways that we, for example, there's no weddings that are practiced, there's no wedding celebrations. Tomorrow night, in fact, I am invited to a wedding. Tomorrow evening, we have traditionally, many people get married tomorrow. In fact, my parents got married in Lag BaOmer, and one or two of my siblings also got married in Lag BaOmer. And who else? What else is Lag BaOmer? I'm going to a wedding tomorrow evening, Lag BaOmer, right? So it's common that people get married in Lag BaOmer, but during this period, we don't take haircuts, we don't listen to music, and there's a lot of different customs in not buying new clothing, unless there's a metzia, you found a real bargain somewhere. Okay, so those are some of the things, but the restrictions are eased from Lag BaOmer. Some people start getting, have weddings continuing from them. Other communities don't actually do weddings until a few days before Shavuos. But that's getting into the technicalities, into the specifics, which I'm not going to go into the specifics right now because there's two opinions in the Talmud. One is that the dying stopped on the 33rd day, which is Lag BaOmer. So that's why this is already a celebration, not just of the day itself, but going forward, one can actually have celebrations. But there's a different opinion I recall reading and learning, is that the dying stopped on the 34th day, okay? But whatever the case, some people, I'm not an expert in this, I know a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But for some reason, a lot of people still continue the practice of the semi-mourning all the way through until a few days before Shavuos, which is, why I guess there's that particular custom of staying through the mourning all the way through till that period. But again, that's getting into the technicalities of it. But whatever the case is, the main point is that Lag BaOmer is a day of tremendous celebration. And that's really what I want to be focusing on in our discussions here, because that's really the highlight, okay? So what I thought I would do with you today is I printed here, and I will read to you a little bit of what the Gemara says about Lag BaOmer. We'll read it aloud, and then we can discuss it and take some lessons from this. The Gemara says Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students from all over the country. Okay, that was in Israel, from the north to the south. And the Talmud describes how they died and the Talmud gives a reason for the pandemic of their time, because they didn't treat each other with respect. Again, the Talmud goes on to tell us that they suffered from this croup, which was a horrible death that so many people died from at the time. So again, there were the symptoms of the death, why they died, physically, the pathophysiological reason for the death, but there's a spiritual reason. We always have to understand the spiritual reason. I don't know if we have any great enough sages in our time to tell us why Corona happened. My own answer could be is God just wanted us to slow down. Perhaps God wanted us to be a little bit more aware of this, to be a little bit more spiritually in tune, or maybe it was God's reminder to us that we feel we're in such control of the world. And, it was God's way of telling us that who's boss. Whatever the case, let's just continue reading the words of the Gemara. The Gemara says, the world was demoralized until Rabbi Akiva came to the rabbis in the south and taught them the Torah. Who were these rabbis in the south? They were Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Lezer ben Shamua. And they preserved the Torah in that difficult time. We learned, says the Gemara, that many who perished all died between Pesach and Shavuos. So certainly, as we could see, we have Rabbi Akiva to thank for the perpetuation of Judaism. Despite his old age, and despite the terrible blow of seeing so many of his students dying. You ever work on something and all of a sudden you see it just goes to waste? I remember when I was writing my dissertation, or in previous times, back in the 90s, I was an entrepreneur. I had a business, actually. I had a newspaper. And back then, sometimes the computer would crash and everything was gone. All the work I did was finito, finished. And it was really, truly devastating. It was not a good feeling to know that I put all that work in, it was gone. Sometimes you just feel that despair, you just want to give up. Think about Rabbi Akiva. He invested in all these students and then they die. So it feels like his work went to waste. And the Gemara actually goes on to quote Rabbi Akiva that if one studied in his youth, he should continue to study in their old age. And if you taught students in youth, you should teach more students in your old age, because it says, in the morning, plant your seed, and in the evening, do not withhold your hand. Yet, despite Rabbi Akiva having a late start, and despite all the struggles and challenges, if you know his history, despite all that, he still continued to persevere. And he found 5 new students, and he taught them everything he knew. And it's these 5 students that he invested all his effort into after losing his previous students. He taught the entire Torah to them. But he didn't just teach the Torah. He trained each one to specialize in a particular area of Torah study. So the students to whom he taught let's say, the mystical aspects of Torah, right? Kabbalah, that was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And he, of course, in turn, which we discussed on Thursday's shir, is the one who gave us Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, right? And he's the one who passed away, like BaOmer, and he's the one who's passing that we celebrate in this day because he asked that it should be celebrated rather than mourned. So there's a lot of different aspects and angles of this that we could talk about. Let's focus for a moment on the Gemara, okay? What I just read from the Gemara here. If anyone wants to look in the Gemara, it's Tractate Yevamas, Daf Samach Beis, Amud Beis, 62b. Okay, the Talmud tells us that the spiritual cause for the passing of Rabbi Akiva's students was that they failed to treat each other with respect, right? Now, you recall, I'm just going to paraphrase a shir I gave 2 weeks ago, where we talked about, in fact, we read it in last week's Parsha, in Parsha's Kedoshim. What's the most fundamental mitzvah of the entire Torah? If you were to choose one verse, now it's interesting, in the Gemara, there's such a discussion amongst the sages, and each one chose a particular verse. Which verse did Rabbi Akiva choose as his primary verse of the whole Torah? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, to love your fellow as yourself, right? That was the one verse. And yet we find that his very own students were the ones who struggled in respecting each other. Right? You wonder, is it possible that Rabbi Akiva's students failed to absorb what their teacher considered the most important, fundamental, critical principle of the whole entire Torah? And there's various answers. And one of them that we discussed was that they were not lacking in love for each other, that they had. But what they were missing was the respect. Their love didn't translate into respect. On the surface, love and respect seem similar, right? And there's you could think that there might be an overlap between them. But there's also a huge difference between them. In fact, one of the greatest challenges in any relationship is managing to balance between love and respect. So if you really want an in-depth discussion of that, go back to the shir, was right after Pesach that we discussed how to like the people you love. Love is a powerful emotion. It drives empathy, concern, care for others, right? At the same time, too much love can be overbearing. It can be stifling. What do they say? What's that phrase? Smothered with love? Too much love. Or what we discussed was that love that's untempered by respect. That can mean that we don't respect boundaries, that we impose our ways of thinking, that it's my way or the highway. If you look at that verse, to love your fellow as yourself, it actually has a preface to it. The verse starts off, Lo sikam v'lo sitar v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha ani Hashem. Lo sikam v'lo sitar means do not bear lo sikam means do not take revenge, do not exact retribution, don't retaliate. V'lo sitar, do not bear a grudge. So the only way you could truly love another, let me just open that verse up in my Chumash. It's last week's Parsha, so we should know exactly. I believe it's chapter 18, verse 19, chapter 19, verse 18. Let's just quickly find it. It's one of those verses you always have to know. Yeah, chapter 19, verse 18. Do not take revenge and do not bear a grudge on your people. Love your fellow as yourself. Ani Hashem, I am God. That's the verse. And what's interesting is I heard a great commentary from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He says, imagine a fellow walks into shul, okay? He's looking for Ruvain. Turns around, are you Ruvain? Are you Ruvain? Are you Ruvain? No, you're not Ruvain. Is he going to get upset if somebody's not Ruvain? No, why are you not Ruvain? I mean, because I'm Ashley, because I'm Benzi, because I'm Brenda, because I'm Cynthia, right? I'm not Ruvain. You're not going to get upset that somebody's not Ruvain. Says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, a beautiful explanation of this verse. He says that just as you're not upset that somebody's not the person who he's not because he's just not that person. Likewise, don't bear a grudge. Don't take revenge, because ultimately we have to realize who's in control of the world. It's all the same Almighty God. And that's why the verse continues, love your fellow as yourself. Okay? Because the love also needs that respect, that tolerance. And that's what our sages tell us. One of the explanations of understanding how the students of Rabbi Akiva although they maybe loved each other. But the love also has to come with those boundaries, has to come with a certain discipline. My friend said to me, he says, my daughter claims I don't respect her privacy. At least that's what she wrote in her diary. Whatever the case, respect gives the people we love that space that they need to make their own decisions, to walk their own path in life. And we need to respect them and their opinions, even if we don't agree with them. But respect alone is also not enough. Imagine watching someone jump off a cliff and doing nothing to save his life because we don't want to intrude in another person's privacy. How ridiculous is that? And in a sense, the world is becoming very much like that today. We have liberalism. Let people do what they want. But that doesn't work. Leonie, you have a question.
Yes, could you say that again? Because I'm writing it down, but I haven't got it. Respect means to...
Respect means a lot of things, right?
Yeah, but that one where you're giving space.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not sure what words I said, but the point I'm making is that respect is not enough. There has to be a combination of respect and love. That's the point I'm making.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. The point is that we have to give people their space, right? So there has to be a combination of love and respect. On the love side, we also have to respect people's boundaries, people's space, right? When we live with other people, we know that as much as there has to be that certain boundaries. Even in a marital relationship, I believe, there has to be boundaries. There has to be certain respect. Parents need to respect the desires of their children, especially when it comes to their adult children. And, at the moment, my kids are all little. But this Sunday, and in fact, you're all invited to come to our shul. Leonie, I know it's a little bit of a schlep from Betty's Bay, but you're most welcome. We'll be celebrating my son's Hanachas Tefillin. It's the beginning of his transition into adulthood. And when he becomes a bar mitzvah, he becomes an adult. And teenagers, it's a whole new challenge. I could just recall back not too long ago when I was in that age and stage of my life. And it's going from, as parents, we love our children. I think sometimes it's a struggle that parents have with allowing children their space to grow to be who they want to be, especially in the religious world. And there's no doubt that I'm as guilty of this. So I think as they're young, we want to mold them. We want to guide them in the right direction. And we just hope they'll make the right decisions for themselves when they get older. But we certainly have to be able to respect those choices that they make. That's not always easy when we have a certain expectation from our children, right? The point I was making, though, is on the one hand, we need the respect, but there also has to be love, right? So respect is not enough. There's a tension between love and respect. Too much of either of them can throw off a relationship. One has to find a balance. But the key to a healthy relationship is to find the proper balance between love and respect, because without that, on the one hand, you could say, well, if it's just love, it could be smothering. People need that space, right? It could be invasive. But respect alone is also, it's distant, it's not caring. So you need to find that balance of both love and respect. I remember in a particular office once, the boss wanted to show his boss. So he put up a sign in his office, "I'm the boss." And when he came back from his lunch break, he found a note taped on it. "Your wife called. She wants her sign back." Okay. Anyways, let's apply this to the students of Rabbi Akiva. Right? The Talmud doesn't say that they were lacking in love for each other. The Talmud says that they were lacking in respect. And this tells us that Rabbi Akiva's students, they didn't fail to learn Rabbi Akiva's teaching on love. Rabbi Akiva said, what's the most fundamental verse of the whole entire Torah is Va'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, to love your fellow as yourself, which we read last Shabbos in the portion of Kedosh. But what they failed, the Talmud is telling us, is to balance that love with respect. So that's something we could all learn to apply. And, the truth is that as is human nature, you could say that each of the students had a unique, nuanced understanding of Rabbi Akiva's teachings. Each one was imbued with a deep love for each other as their teacher, Rabbi Akiva, told them that, right? So each one was anxious to share the unique understanding together. Each one felt my way of understanding the Torah or my teacher's explanation of it is the correct way. So, and the others weren't necessarily accepting their view because perhaps they were clinging on to their own view, to their own perspective, then this created that kind of a friction between them. Because what sadly existed was that they weren't necessarily respecting the other person's perspective. And think about that. How often that happens. You ever sit at a Shabbos table, you're sitting around with friends, and each one feels their way is the correct way. So think about if each one would accept the other person's perspective, how different it would be. Right? But that's a challenge we oftentimes have, especially when it comes to politics. And I don't think the world was ever as polarized when it comes to politics as we see it today. Look what's going on in the US where I come from. It's so polarized. So the Talmud is saying that they absorbed that teaching of loving each other. But it was their deep love, their concern for each other that sadly led them to the sense of disrespect. Had they not sufficiently cared for each other, they wouldn't have the need to correct the ways of the others, that your thinking is wrong. But they failed to find the proper balance between love and respect. Their focus was lacking that way of tolerating and respecting each other's perspectives, seeing things from another opinion, from another view, from another Weltanschauung, perhaps call it. So it's during this time that we mourn their loss during the Omer, and that we celebrate Lag BaOmer. We take the time to reflect on the importance of healthy relationships, to follow the teachings of the Torah. It's not just about serving God, it's also about connecting properly with others. Just as there are mitzvahs that are between God and us, right? Ritual mitzvahs. Whether you keep kosher or not, is between you and God. Whether you observe Shabbos, that's God's business between you and Hashem, no one else. But there are other mitzvahs that are ben adam lachavero, that are interpersonal between us and our fellow human beings. Social mitzvahs. God wants us to have healthy relationships with others, not just with God. We need to be able to follow, ladies and gents, just a second. Just a second, ladies and gents. Hi, Stephen. Yes, sorry, the picture wasn't downloading. I'm just in the middle of a shiur, but I can't find it. The picture won't download, so I can't see anything.
Okay, because it looks like you read it.
Yeah, I read your message to me, but sorry, guys, just a minute. But the picture's not coming through. I don't know why. It's not loading. Maybe, do you mind to resend it? I'll respond right away. I could take a second from the... Yeah.
It is right. I've checked it myself.
Oh, okay, good. So you've checked it. Perfect. Thank you. Apologies. I'm just, I don't, the picture wasn't loading, and I figured I'll call you after the share is done. But since you called, I'm sure they don't mind that stuff.
She wants to do it now. So, okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Really appreciate it. All the best. Take care. Thanks. Be well. Apologies, guys, and thanks for your tolerance of me during this moment of my social disturbance. So what was I saying? We have to have our relationship between us and God as one side of the coin. But at the same time, we have to strike a balance between love and respect in our interpersonal relationships. We have to practice how to be tolerant of others despite them getting under our skin and getting on our nerves. We have to find that way of having that respect and love. And that's what we discussed in our previous year about how to refine our different aspects of our character with an eye towards becoming a better person. But becoming a better person is not just about me being better in God's eyes. The way I can become a better person is if I'm better to my fellow human beings, to everyone, right? So we all have to find ways of fine-tuning ourselves, not just between us and God, but between us and our fellow human beings as well. So that was one aspect. The other aspect that we were discussing on Thursday was about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And please God, we'll talk more about him tomorrow. Is that we celebrate Lag BaOmer for two reasons. Okay, we said one was the passing of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and he was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, and he lived himself a very long life, and he taught a lot of Torah, especially the deepest aspects of Torah. And please God, tomorrow I'll go back into learning and understanding how he wasn't just a great rabbi, and so to say, a great teacher and thinker, but how he was a great caring person as well. And I think that's, at the end of the day, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Okay? So we can't just think about Rabbi Shimon that we celebrate on Lag BaOmer. You think we're celebrating him just because he taught us Zohar, because he taught Jewish mysticism? What is it even? The Zohar describes so much about Rabbi Shimon, which we touched on a little bit last week. I'll try to bring up some of those texts tomorrow. It says on the day of his passing, he said that he received heavenly permission to reveal mystical secrets that he wanted to share his entire life, but he was restricted by heaven. And he went on, before he passed away, to reveal deep Kabbalistic mysteries that were never previously taught. And as he talked, the Talmud says his face shone with this celestial brightness. It was impossible to look at him. And that light enveloped his bed. And his students, they just couldn't, they needed, you think of a mask, what we wear today for our mouths, they had to put on probably tinted sunglasses, right? And they sat beyond the ring of that flame and they absorbed his teachings. And the last words that he said were words of Tehillim. He said, for there Hashem has commanded the blessings of everlasting life, which is in Tehillim, chapter 133. So towards the end of Tehillim, if you got your Tehillim in front of you, see, it's worthwhile to have one of these books or a phone, because on the phone, you could always check everything up. But right here in this verse, it's a very short chapter. It's got only 3 verses. And he says these words, that this is about eternal life. And this is all in his room. But they couldn't bear the brightness that was shining forth from him. Anyways, that's part of what it says, that he passed away with uttering these words, Chaim ad ha'olam, everlasting life. And they mourned his passing that entire day. And towards the end of the day, they said there was a veil that surrounded him, and they could see that Rabbi Shimon was lying on his right side with a serene smile on his face. And when they carried him on his final journey, he was buried in Miron, which is where many Jews tomorrow evening will be celebrating Lag BaOmer. I remember one year I went to Israel, I think it was 2005, for Lag BaOmer. It was an incredible experience being in Israel on Lag BaOmer in Miron. If you haven't experienced it yet, you have to take a moment, you have to experience it. And they say a heavenly voice came out and it said, "Arise and assemble for the celebration of Rabbi Shimon." And these words are actually inscribed on by his gravesite. And there was a tremendous celebration. Well, I'm assuming then perhaps the people were sad, but Rabbi Shimon, he asked that the day should be celebrated. So that's what happens on Lag BaOmer. Thousands of Jews, I think under ordinary circumstances, 500,000 people converge to his resting place on Lag BaOmer. Unfortunately, due to Corona still existing and Israel restricting who could come in, I think that it's probably very much limited how the celebration takes place now. But the Talmud says that he wanted that his funeral procession should be a celebration. In fact, one of the Rebbes of Chabad also requested that they shouldn't be sad on the day he passed away. It's a Hasidic niggin that they said, "The Rebbe geheißen Freilach sein, Freilach sein, Freilach soll men sein," which means the Rebbe requested we should be happy. It's a very sad song, this thing. The Rebbe said we should be happy even though he passed away. But the point is that we learn that the soul rejoices when it returns to the heavenly realm. And in fact, the term Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai used, he said it should be Yom Hilula, which is like a wedding celebration. And that's what happens on Lag BaOmer. It's a very festive day. And although the day of his passing was one that was sad, of course, for family and friends, those who are mourning the earthly absence of Rabbi Shimon, you could say that the fact of the matter is, we discussed last week, that when a person passes away, we see all their life accomplishments coming together on that day as well. So there's something to celebrate. We mourn, but we also celebrate their achievements that they accomplished in their life. And this is what we celebrate on Lag BaOmer. It's a day to dwell on the primacy of the soul, the purpose of its descent coming into this world, and the joy that it takes from connecting to God and from achieving, from accomplishing, from doing what the soul comes into this world to do. As long as the soul is in a body, that connection, of course, is here and fulfills its purpose, and it's tethered by the body. And when the soul goes on to its final journey, it's completed its mission, its purpose in this world. Well, hopefully so, right? So that's why on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's, the day of his passing, the Gemara says we celebrate the events that occurred. Now, let me just read to you a little bit more from the Gemara. Let me quickly find which Talmudic page I wanted to read. Give me a second. Okay, let me just read a few words, a few lines here. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, if a person plows in the plowing season, plants in the planting season, reaps in the reaping season, threshes in the threshing season, and winnows when the wind blows, when will he study Torah? Right? We actually discussed this last week. Rabbi Shimon basically was of the opinion that we have to dedicate time for Torah study. Right? He set a very high standard. He believed that we should devote much of our life to spiritual pursuits, to studying Torah, to prayer, and not worry about the physical concerns of this world. The Gemara doesn't rule like him, right? We concluded the Gemara says that a person has to have a balance of physical and spiritual, of work and prayer, and Torah study. But the point, though, is we see what his perspective in life was, and just to spend a few more minutes and conclude a little bit of some lessons from Rabbi Shimon, is that we have to think about what are we here for? People find excuses all the time why there's no time to study Torah, why there's no time to do mitzvahs, why they can't come to shul. They can blame it on COVID. And to tell you the truth, probably those who blame it on COVID were the same people who had no time for it before. I'm not talking about those who are being careful, generally speaking. I'm just talking about those who find every excuse and reason why they don't have the time. Okay? We need to find time in life to have a balance. We need to find time to eat. We need to find time to sleep. We need to find time to get dressed and to brush our teeth and to work and to play and for our spiritual purposes as well. Every single one of us, there's only 24 hours in a day. We all know that we have to figure out how are we going to utilize that time in the right way. Each one of us has those same 24 hours. So how are we going to fulfill our purpose in this world without saying I squandered that time away? The Talmud relates a story about a certain pious woman that she would step out on the porch every morning. She would call out, God, please send me breakfast. And it relates that she had an atheist neighbor who would say, there's no God. And it continued this way for a while, for a long time, until the neighbor decided she was going to pull a prank on her. So the next day, when the woman stepped out to pray for breakfast, this fellow snuck into her home and left breakfast on the table. After breakfast, the woman went out and said, "Thank you, God, for delivering my breakfast." So the neighbor, who was waiting for this opportunity, jumped down and said, "I got you there. It wasn't God. It was me." And the woman said, "Thank you, God, for sending me my breakfast and forcing this devil to deliver it." Anyways, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai lived in a more spiritual way. He lived, and we're going to have to probably talk a little bit more about his history tomorrow, where he actually spent time in a cave. And there's many stories about that, about his life. And I guess having that spiritual perspective helped him in a spiritual way. But again, the Talmud doesn't conclude that that's the correct way to live one's life, maybe because he was on a particularly high level. And the question is even, can you find a balance between the Talmud's perspective of Torah and Derech Eretz, where you can make the time for study and prayer and working, as well as Rabbi Shimon's lifestyle? And some people would like to work and, make enough money to sustain themselves, and they don't need all those bonus luxury extras, and spend more time studying. Rabbi Shimon was once conversing with his colleagues, and one of them suggested that the Romans did so much good for us. Think about it. The Romans, even though they destroyed the temple, which is terrible, they also brought some good to Israel. They built roads, they built bridges. These are things that helped the Jewish inhabitants, the citizens of Israel. He's to help us, even though they collected taxes from us. They did it for their own immoral purposes. So unfortunately, somebody informed on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and when the Roman authorities heard that he slandered them, they were out to get him. So that's when he was forced into hiding. And first he was hiding in a shul somewhere in Israel, and his wife would bring him food every day. It was a secret. Only she knew where he was, and his son. But then they realized it was safer for him if nobody knew his location. And that's when he moved into a cave for 13 years. And the Talmud relates that a miracle occurred, that there was a carob tree that grew, that blossomed outside this cave. And there was a wellspring from which he was able to drink and to wash his clothing. And that was it. In fact, the Talmud says that he only got dressed for prayer. The rest of the day, he and his son who stayed with him, they covered themselves in sand, and they would sit and study Torah in the sand. That was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. There's many interesting other stories about him. So, these stories just illustrate what a great sage he was and how indeed he lived that spiritual lifestyle. So, but I think only when one is on that spiritual level, because can they actually live that way? Under ordinary circumstances, they would have died, right? It was miraculous that they were sustained through a carob tree and a wellspring of water, that they were able to wash their clothes that way and just eat carobs, drink water, and live, covered in sand, only getting dressed for prayer. So they were unique individuals. They didn't just talk the talk, they walked the walk. But the truth is, the Talmud says God was not satisfied with this. And as events unfolded, Rabbi Shimon had to go beyond this approach and learn to balance that spiritualistic approach to life with a more materialistic one. And so maybe tomorrow we could go a little bit further into that, because there is a discussion in the Gemara of what happened and how Rabbi Shimon couldn't reemerge into normal life that way. because he was completely divorced of materialism. And that's not the ideal way that we should be living our lives. We have to live our lives in a way that we balance the two. So we learned today about the balance of love and respect, and we're learning about the importance of the balance between spiritual and physical life. And certainly the story gets a lot more technical in the Gemara, but I think we'll have to conclude today's shir here. And please God, tomorrow we'll continue. So tomorrow's shir, we'll talk about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, just a little bit more about his life, his concern for the welfare of his students and life. And we'll talk a little bit about the outings, how to celebrate Lag BaOmer as well. So I guess tomorrow will be a continuation. And please God, I'll have some time to put together some slides so we can make it a little bit more interesting than just listening, just looking and listening. Any questions before we conclude today's discussion? Okay.
I didn't hear properly. Did all 24,000 students die?
That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says there were all 24,000 students, and he restarted with 5 new students. One of them was Rabbi Shimon. So he obviously wasn't one of those who died in the... Well, it says Rabbi Shimon, but I don't know if it's the same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai or if it's a different Rabbi Shimon. But the Gemara says he started from scratch with 5 new students. What's interesting is that he wasn't affected by this plague, that it only affected his students. You know, these days they're saying Corona affects the elderly more so than the young, although there's plenty of young people who are unfortunately casualties of this pandemic as well. But the Gemara does say, to answer your question, that it was all 24,000 students who died.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Thank you for the shir, Rabbi.
Tomorrow. What's that, Selwyn?
I said thank you very much for the shir.
Pleasure. Tomorrow we'll continue, and you're all welcome tomorrow evening to come for a brai and a bonfire and a kumzitz at my shul. We'll start about 5:30 p.m. till about 7 p.m.
We would love it, Rabbi, but it's not easy.
I hear you.
From here, it's the problem from Golden Acres.
I hear. You know, we have some participants here in Cape Town and in Israel and in Australia. And let's see if you guys can make it over. A little further away.
Be fantastic.
Maybe we could do a Zoom from there. We'll see what we could do. Perhaps we could do a Zoom so everyone could join in.
Thanks, Rabbi.
All the best. Zach, so good to see you.